The world had shrunk for Arthur Pendleton. At 88 years old, it was no longer a vast map of continents and possibilities, but the four walls of a dusty farmhouse, the squeak of a loose floorboard, and the faint, sweet smell of the wife who is no longer there. His life had become a study in subtraction. Friends had faded like old photographs left in the sun. Family, scattered by careers and their own growing broods, had become voices on a phone, their calls growing less frequent, their words tinged with a gentle, pitying distance. He was a relic, a landmark on a map nobody used anymore. Each morning, Arthur would wake not to the promise of a new day, but to the crushing weight of the one that had just passed, and the one before that, an endless chain of silent, gray hours. He'd sit in his worn armchair, the one Eleanor had always claimed was the most comfortable, and stare out the window at a world that continued spinning without him. The will to participate had withered first, followed by the will to even observe. Now, all that remained was a profound and hollow ache, a readiness for the final quiet. He was about to perish, not from a sickness of the body, but from a terminal loneliness of the soul. He had already said his goodbyes, whispered into the empty rooms of his house. He was just waiting for the end. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon in streaks of orange and purple, a final, beautiful spectacle he no longer had the heart to appreciate, something impossible happened. It began not as a sight, but as a feeling, a low, resonant vibration that traveled from the earth, up through the worn planks of his porch, and into the bones of his feet. It was a presence. And then, at the edge of his overgrown yard, where the wild grass met the tree line, a shape emerged from the deepening shadows. It was massive, a silhouette of impossible bulk, crowned with a sweep of formidable horns. It was a bull, not a stray calf or a neighbor's steer. This was a creature of mythic proportions, dark as a moonless night, and it was standing perfectly still, watching his house, watching him. The first emotion to pierce through Arthur's fog of apathy was not curiosity, but a primal, electric shock of fear. He was a frail man, his bones as brittle as dried twigs. A creature of that size, of that power, could end him in a heartbeat. His mind, sluggish for so long, raced through the possibilities. It must have escaped from the old Miller farm, miles down the road. It was likely agitated, lost, dangerous. He should go inside, bolt the door, and call Sheriff Brody. He should do something. But his legs, rooted to the porch, refused to move. The bull did not charge. It did not paw the ground or snort with aggression. It simply stood there, a statue carved from midnight, its massive head raised, its dark eyes fixed on him. There was an unnerving intelligence in its stillness, a profound and deliberate calm that defied every instinct Arthur had about wild animals. He saw the gentle rise and fall of its powerful chest, the occasional twitch of an ear catching the evening sounds. The fear began to recede, replaced by a bewildering sense of wonder. Minutes stretched into an eternity, the two of them locked in a silent tableau across the dying light. Arthur's throat was dry. He hadn't spoken a full sentence to another living being in days, and the sound of his own voice, when it finally came, was a foreign, rusty croak. "What do you want?" he whispered, the words swallowed by the vast twilight. The bull offered no reply, save for a slow blink of its long-lashed eyes. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition. It felt less like an encounter with a farm animal and more like an audience with something ancient and wise. Arthur watched it for another hour, until the last vestiges of light were gone and the bull was just a darker shape against the darkness. He finally pushed himself to his feet, his joints protesting, and shuffled back inside. But he didn't bolt the door. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He acted with purpose. He found an old metal bucket in the mudroom, rinsed the dust from it under the creaking faucet, and filled it with cool, fresh water. His hands shook, and he sloshed some onto the floor, but he didn't care. He carried it out to the edge of the porch, his heart thumping with a strange mix of residual fear and nascent hope. He set the bucket down, a simple offering. "Here," he said, his voice a little stronger this time. If you're thirsty. He retreated back inside, leaving the porch light on. And for the first time, in a very long time, he didn't go to his chair to wait for nothing. He went to the window to watch for something. The bull did not leave. When Arthur woke the next morning, the gray light of dawn filtering through his dusty window, his first thought was of the creature. He pushed himself out of bed with an urgency that had been absent for a decade, his bare feet padding quickly to the living room. He looked out, his breath held tight in his chest, and there it was. It had moved closer, now standing under the ancient oak tree in the center of his yard, a silent, magnificent guardian. The water bucket was empty. A small, unfamiliar warmth spread through Arthur's chest. It was the feeling of being needed, even in this small, inexplicable way. This simple fact, that another living being depended on him for a bucket of water, was a stronger anchor to the world than any phone call or distant memory had been in years. He started a new routine. Each morning, he'd fill the bucket. Then, remembering the old, forgotten hay bales in the barn, he began forking small piles onto the grass. The bull, whom Arthur had started calling Kai in his mind, a name that felt soft and strong all at once, would wait patiently. It never approached him with menace. It would watch him finish his task from a respectful distance, and only after Arthur had retreated to the porch would it amble forward to drink and eat. In the afternoons, Arthur would bring his chair out onto the porch, and he would talk. At first, his words were hesitant, simple observations about the weather or the birds. But soon, the dam of his long-held silence broke. He told Kai about Eleanor, about the way she laughed, her hands always covered in flour from baking. He spoke of his time in the war, stories he'd never even told his own children. He confessed his loneliness, his fear, his feeling of being utterly used up. The bull would stand nearby, chewing its cud, its deep, dark eyes fixed on him. It was the most profound listener he had ever known. It didn't offer advice or pity. It simply stood, and in its immense, quiet presence, Arthur's words found a safe harbor. The house behind him, once a tomb of silence, was no longer empty. It was filled with the quiet anticipation of these meetings. The dust on the furniture seemed less oppressive. The light through the windows seemed a little brighter. Arthur himself was changing. He noticed it one day when he caught his reflection in the hall mirror. The stoop in his shoulders was less pronounced. The hollows under his eyes seemed shallower. There was a light in his gaze that wasn't just a reflection of the window. It was coming from within. He was caring for something, and in doing so, he was beginning to care for himself. The simple, repetitive acts of providing food and water for the mysterious bull had become a ritual of his own salvation. Inevitably, the town noticed. A 1,000-pound bull appearing in the yard of the town recluse was not something that could remain a secret for long. The first to arrive was Sheriff Brody, a man whose worldview was built on regulations and liability forms. He pulled his cruiser up Arthur's long, unkempt driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust, and stepped out with a look of weary impatience. He saw a massive, potentially dangerous animal. He saw a lawsuit waiting to happen. He saw a problem that needed to be solved, quickly and efficiently. "Arthur," he said, his hand resting on his hip, his gaze fixed on Kai, who stood placidly by the oak tree. "What in the world is this? Folks are calling, spooked. You can't just keep a bull in your front yard." Arthur, who had been sitting on his porch, stood up. He felt a protective instinct flare inside him, hot and fierce. It was an emotion he hadn't felt in a very long time. "He's not bothering anyone, John," Arthur said, his voice steady. "He's quiet. He just stays." The sheriff sighed, shaking his head. "He's a bull, Arthur, not a puppy. He's unpredictable, a stray. He needs to be rounded up and taken to the county auction. It's for everyone's safety, including yours." The word auction landed like a stone in Arthur's stomach. The thought of Kai, his silent, gentle friend, being prodded into a trailer, sold to the highest bidder, perhaps for slaughter, it was unbearable. This was the first real challenge, the first conflict that had pierced his quiet world. For years, Arthur had yielded to everything, to grief, to loneliness, to the relentless march of time. He had given up fighting for himself. But now, standing on his porch, a frail old man against a uniformed officer of the law, he found a strength he thought was long dead. "No," Arthur said. The word was quiet, but it was forged from steel. "He stays here. With me. He's my friend." Sheriff Brody looked from the defiant old man to the placid bull and back again. He saw not a friend, but a ticking time bomb. "Arthur, be reasonable. I'm trying to help you." "Then leave him be," Arthur insisted. "He's not a stray. He chose to be here." The sheriff left that day with a warning. He'd be back, and he'd bring animal control. He was giving Arthur a few days to come to his senses. The encounter left Arthur shaken, but also strangely invigorated. The threat from the outside world had solidified his bond with Kai. It was no longer just a man and a bull. It was us against them. That evening, as Arthur put out the hay, he walked closer to Kai than ever before. The bull watched him approach, unmoving. Arthur reached out a trembling hand, stopping just inches from its massive head. "They don't understand, do they, boy?" he murmured. "They just see a beast. They don't see you." And for the first time, the great bull took a slow step forward and gently, so gently, nudged Arthur's outstretched hand with its wet nose. The touch was a covenant, a promise. Arthur knew, in that moment, that he would not, could not, let anyone take his friend away. The weight of Sheriff Brody's threat settled over the farm, a new kind of silence filled with quiet resolve. Arthur began spending every possible moment with Kai, as if memorizing him. He would sit on an overturned bucket just a few feet from where the great animal grazed, watching the powerful muscles shift beneath his dark hide, the patient flick of his tail. It was during one of these long, contemplative afternoons that he saw it. He had been tracing the lines on Kai's face with his eyes, the gentle slope from his brow to his nose, when he noticed something on his flank, partially hidden by the coarse hair. It was a brand. But it wasn't the clean, clear mark of a reputable ranch. This was a crude, ugly scar, puckered and old, as if burned into his flesh with haste and cruelty. As he looked closer, he saw other, fainter marks, thin, silvery lines of old scars crisscrossing his powerful shoulders and back, a story of past pain, written on his very skin. In that instant, Arthur's understanding of Kai shifted from mystery to empathy. This magnificent creature wasn't just an outsider, he was a survivor. He had a history, a past filled with suffering he could only guess at. He had been hurt by humans, branded and scarred, and yet here he was, offering nothing but a gentle, trusting presence to a lonely old man. Arthur saw a reflection. He saw his own invisible scars, the ones left by grief, by isolation, by the slow erosion of purpose. He saw his own story of being cast aside, of being left to face the world alone. Have you ever looked into the eyes of another being and felt, with absolute certainty, that you were seeing your own soul, that their silent struggle was a perfect echo of your own? In that quiet pasture, under the wide-open sky, two wounded healers found each other. A man who had forgotten how to live, and a bull who had every reason to hate the world, had formed a bond, not of ownership, but of mutual recognition. "Someone hurt you, didn't they, boy?" Arthur whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Kai lifted his head and let out a low, soft rumble, a sound that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. It was a sound of agreement, of shared sorrow, of a past finally being seen. From that day on, Arthur's mission was no longer just about companionship. It was about sanctuary. This farm was not just his home. It was Kai's refuge. He had to protect this place, this peace, not just for himself, but for the friend who had journeyed through a world of pain to find it. He started small, mending the broken sections of the old wire fence along the property line. His hands, clumsy and stiff with arthritis, fumbled with the tools, but he worked with a dogged determination, his frail body powered by a newfound purpose. This fence was no longer meant to keep the world out. It was meant to keep his friend safe. The crisis arrived with the sky. The weather had been turning all day, the air growing heavy and thick, the color of a deep bruise. By late afternoon, The clouds rolled in, a churning, angry mass of black and gray. The wind began to howl, whipping through the old oak tree and rattling the windows of the farmhouse. Then came the rain, a torrential downpour that turned the yard into a muddy swamp. And then, the thunder. It wasn't the distant rumble of a summer storm. It was a series of violent, cracking explosions that seemed to split the sky right above the house. Each clap was followed by a flash of brilliant white lightning that bleached the world for a terrifying second. Arthur stood at his window, his knuckles white as he gripped the sill. His heart hammered against his ribs, not for himself, but for Kai. He imagined the terror the bull must be feeling, the deafening noise, the flashing lights, the lashing rain. Animals panicked in storms like this. They ran blindly, crashed through fences, injured themselves. He pictured Kai, terrified and alone, bolting into the dark woods, lost forever. The thought was more terrifying than the storm itself. He couldn't bear it. Without a second thought for his own safety, Arthur grabbed his old raincoat from the hook by the door, a coat he hadn't worn in years, and plunged out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly tore the door from his hand. The rain hit him like a physical blow, cold and stinging, soaking his thin pants in seconds. He was 88 years old, a fragile collection of bone and memory out in the middle of a violent thunderstorm. It was madness. He called Kai's name, but the wind snatched the words from his mouth and tore them to shreds. He stumbled through the mud, his old boots slipping, his eyes squinting against the rain. He found him. But Kai was not panicked. He was not running. He was standing under the broad, ancient branches of the oak tree, his massive body perfectly still, facing the direction of the house. He looked as though he had been waiting. Arthur staggered towards him, half blinded by rain and relief. He reached the shelter of the tree, water streaming from his face and clothes. He stood there, panting, beside the enormous creature. In that moment, surrounded by the chaos of the storm, a profound and unshakable calm emanated from the bull. Arthur, trembling from cold and adrenaline, did something guided purely by instinct. He reached out and leaned his full weight against Kai's solid, warm flank. The bull didn't flinch. He merely shifted his weight slightly, bracing himself to better support the frail man. The heat from his body seeped through Arthur's wet coat, a deep, living warmth that pushed back the cold. The terrifying roar of the thunder seemed more distant, muffled by the sheer, solid presence of his friend. In the heart of the storm, leaning against 1,000 pounds of quiet strength, Arthur Pendleton felt completely and utterly safe. As promised, Sheriff Brody returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. With him was a woman in practical boots and a durable jacket, her face framed by short, sensible hair. She carried a professional-looking bag. "Arthur," the sheriff said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "this is Dr. Evans. She's the best large animal vet in 3 counties. She's just going to assess the situation." Dr. Evans was the embodiment of the supportive expert, though she didn't know it yet. She approached the situation with a calm, clinical eye, her expression neutral. She, like the sheriff, saw a potential danger, but she also saw more. She saw an old man standing guard over a bull with a fierce paternal love in his eyes, and she saw a bull that showed no signs of aggression or fear, only a quiet curiosity. "He won't let you get close," the sheriff warned. "He's not tame." Arthur ignored him. "It's all right, boy," he said softly to Kai, who was watching the newcomers with his usual placid gaze. "She's a friend." Dr. Evans observed their interaction, her professional skepticism slowly giving way to fascination. She watched as Arthur walked slowly towards the bull, murmuring to him. She saw the way Kai's ears swiveled to follow the sound of Arthur's voice, the soft look in his dark eyes. This was not the behavior of a typical stray bull. "Can I try to approach him, Arthur?" she asked, her voice gentle, respectful. Slowly, "I just want to look at him." Arthur nodded. Dr. Evans moved with the practiced ease of someone who understood animals. She didn't approach head-on, but from the side, speaking in a low, soothing tone. Kai watched her every move, but remained calm, his trust seemingly anchored by Arthur's presence beside him. Incredibly, He allowed her to get close enough to run a hand along his back, and then to examine him. Her skilled fingers found the ugly, scarred brand on his flank. She traced its rough edges. "This is a bad one," she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. "Inhumane." She checked his teeth, his eyes, his hooves. The entire time, Kai stood as still as a mountain, his trust absolute as long as Arthur was there. When she was finished, Dr. Evans stepped back, a look of profound thought on her face. She turned to the sheriff. "John," she said, her voice firm, "this isn't just a bull. I mean, he is, biologically. But his temperament, it's extraordinary. I've worked with rodeo bulls, farm bulls, prize-winning sires. I have never seen a mature, uncastrated male this calm, this sentient. Especially not around strangers." The sheriff looked stunned. "So, he's not dangerous?" Dr. Evans considered her words carefully. "Any animal this size has the potential to be dangerous. But this one? He's showing no signs of aggression. On the contrary, he seems to be actively choosing to be gentle. His bond with Arthur is, well, it's remarkable. Taking him from here would be a cruelty, a deep one." Arthur felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees. He had been seen. His truth, their truth, had been validated by an expert. He looked at Dr. Evans with tears welling in his eyes, a silent thank you passing between them. The vet had arrived as a skeptical authority, but she was leaving as an ally, the first person from the outside world to see Kai not for what he was, but for who he was. Dr. Evans was not the kind of person to leave a puzzle unsolved. The crude brand mark on Kai's flank bothered her. It wasn't registered. It was the mark of an outlaw operation. Driven by a professional curiosity that had now become a personal investment, she spent the next few days making calls, sending photos of the brand to old contacts, and digging through online forums for ranchers and livestock rescue organizations. Finally, she got a hit. The brand belonged to a now defunct and disgraced rodeo outfit from 2 states over. They were notorious for their brutal training methods, acquiring cheap, aggressive bulls and pushing them past their limits for spectacle. They were shut down by authorities years ago, but not before countless animals had suffered. The story she pieced together was heartbreaking. Kai was likely born into this world of pain. He would have been considered a practice bull, used and abused by aspiring cowboys, shocked, roped, and tormented to fuel his rage for the arena. He was not a beast by nature, but a victim, systematically tortured until he became one. His scars were not from fights with other animals, but from the tools of men. He was a creature who had only ever known cruelty and violence at the hands of humans. And then, somehow, he had escaped. Perhaps a gate was left unlatched during the chaos of the operation being shut down. Perhaps he had finally broken through a fence in a desperate bid for freedom. His journey from that place of torment to Arthur's quiet, overgrown farm was a pilgrimage. It wasn't a random wandering. It was a search. He had walked for miles, across highways and through forests, driven by an instinct for survival and a deeper, more profound yearning for peace. He was seeking sanctuary. And somehow, through some miracle of animal intuition, he had found the one place, the one person, that could offer it. He had found another soul who was also trapped, not by fences and prods, but by grief and loneliness. When Dr. Evans drove back out to the farm to tell Arthur what she had learned, the old man listened in silence, his hand resting on Kai's broad neck. The story didn't bring him sadness. It brought him clarity. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Kai's gentleness was not just a personality trait. It was a conscious choice. He was a survivor who had chosen peace over bitterness, trust over fear. He had every right to be a monster, but he had chosen to be a friend. "So he came here," Arthur said, his voice thick with awe. "He came all this way to find a safe place." Dr. Evans nodded, her own eyes misty. "It seems so, Arthur. It seems he found the one person in the world who needed a safe place just as much as he did." The mystery of the bull's arrival was solved, but it was replaced by a truth far more powerful. This wasn't a random event. It was destiny. It was two broken lives, shattered by different circumstances, finding their way back to wholeness together. The story, now armed with the weight of Dr. Evans's professional validation and the poignant details of Kai's past, began to spread through the small town like wildfire. It was no longer just gossip about the crazy old man and the stray bull. It transformed into something else, something closer to a local legend, a modern parable. People started to drive by Arthur's farm, slowing down not with fear, but with a sense of wonder. They saw not a threat, but the incredible tableau, the frail old man sitting peacefully on his porch, and the magnificent, scarred bull grazing calmly in the yard. The narrative had flipped. Arthur was no longer the forgotten recluse. He was the wise guardian. Kai was no longer a dangerous beast. He was a symbol of resilience and peace. The change was palpable. One morning, Arthur found a bag of expensive, sweet-smelling feed on his porch with a simple, unsigned note that read, "For your friend." A few days later, a pickup truck from the local hardware store pulled up, and two young men got out. They were the sons of a man Arthur had known years ago. "Sheriff Brody told us you were mending this fence by yourself, Mr. Pendleton," one of them said, gesturing to Arthur's slow, painstaking work. "Figured you could use a hand. We brought some new posts." Arthur was speechless. For the first time in years, he wasn't alone. The very community that he had felt so disconnected from was now reaching out, not with pity, but with respect and a shared sense of purpose. The fence, which he had started as a solitary act of defiance to keep the world at bay, became a communal project. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in a decade came by with tools, with thermoses of coffee, with stories of their own. They worked alongside him, replacing the rusty wire, digging new post holes, their laughter and chatter filling the air that had once been so silent. They would ask about Kai, and Arthur, once a man of few words, would proudly tell his story, their story. The fence, that potent metaphor for barriers, was being rebuilt not to isolate, but to include. It was a perimeter of protection built by a community that had chosen to embrace a miracle instead of fear it. Arthur, who had believed his life was over, found himself at the center of a vibrant, caring circle. He was no longer just the keeper of a bull. He was the keeper of a story that had reminded an entire town of the power of compassion, of looking past the surface to see the truth of a soul. His farm had become a destination, a place where people could come to witness a quiet, profound testament to the fact that friendship can be found in the most unexpected of forms, and that it has the power to heal not just one life, but many. The days that followed settled into a new kind of peace, one that was richer and more vibrant than any Arthur had ever known. The gray fog that had shrouded his world for so long had completely burned away, replaced by the brilliant, clear colors of a life being fully lived. His mornings were no longer a burden, but a gift. He would wake with the sun, his body still old but his spirit renewed, and his first act was always to go to the window and see his friend, a constant, reassuring presence in the yard. The transformation was complete. He was no longer a ghost haunting the rooms of his past. He was Arthur Pendleton, caretaker of Kai, a man with a purpose. He walked with a lighter step. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that surprised even himself. He engaged with the visitors who came, sharing his story with a quiet pride. He had gone from a man waiting to die to a man teaching others how to live, simply by the example of his profound and unlikely friendship. His bond with Kai was the steady, beating heart of his new world. There were no more grand crises or dramatic turning points. There was just the gentle, rhythmic beauty of their days together. The simple rituals of providing water and hay, the long afternoons spent in shared silence, the soft nuzzle of Kai's nose against his hand. Each moment was a quiet miracle. The fear and loneliness that had once been his constant companions were gone, replaced by a deep and abiding sense of contentment. He had been given a second chance, a final chapter he never thought he would get to write. and it was a beautiful one. One evening, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in the same fiery colors he had once been too numb to see, Arthur sat in his chair on the porch. Kai was grazing peacefully nearby, the golden light catching the deep, dark sheen of his coat. The world was quiet, but it was a living quiet, filled with the gentle sound of Kai's chewing and the chirp of crickets tuning up for the night. The rebuilt fence stood as a proud dark line against the horizon, a symbol not of division, but of communal love. Arthur looked at the magnificent animal, this creature who had wandered out of the wilderness and straight into the barren landscape of his heart, and he felt a wave of gratitude so immense it filled his entire being. Kai had not just saved him from loneliness, he had saved him from himself. He had pulled him back from the edge of oblivion and reminded him what it felt like to love and be loved, to care and be cared for. He had given him back his life. Arthur leaned forward, his old voice a soft, clear whisper in the twilight. "Thank you," he said. It was a simple phrase for a debt so profound it could never be repaid. The great bull stopped grazing. He lifted his massive head, his dark, ancient eyes meeting Arthur's. And in the quiet understanding that passed between them, in that sacred space between a man and a bull under the vast, forgiving sky, was a love story for the ages. A story of how a mysterious creature came to an old man's house, not to change his fate, but to give him one.